Before we get started with the webinar today, please allow me to briefly introduce you to Women++, the nonprofit association behind this prep event. So we are a Swiss-based nonprofit with a mission to increase diversity in tech, specifically here in Switzerland. Our core values of leadership, education, inclusion, and collaboration guide the design of our initiatives. And we have around 80% of female participation ratio in all our initiatives, which is actually achieved by just implementing women-friendly, hands-on initiatives designed to attract more female talent to the industry, support the transition to tech, and facilitate leadership in the sector. So this is one of the many preparatory events leading up to Hack and Lead 2023. So for those of you who don't know what is Hack and Lead, I'll briefly explain. It's a women-friendly hackathon, and it's the first of its kind in Switzerland, which started, the first edition was in 2018, and we were able to do the second edition in 2019, before the pandemic hit, which that's the reason why we stopped, and now we're coming back in November this year. So why a women-friendly hackathon? What does this mean? So we believe that in order to increase the participation ratio of women in hackathons, we have to face the reality and expectations of an average woman. So studies show that in particular, women want safe spaces where they are not the only women in the room to contribute. So women feel the need to have the exact skills, the skill set to take part in a project, to be prepared. So by attending preparatory events, meet like-minded individuals before the hackathon starts, they are able to also connect and build teams in advance. And finally, childcare. In Europe, 85% of parents who reduce their working hours are to take care of children are women. A necessary format, which includes mentorship support during the event. So you will have different tech companies based in Switzerland sponsoring the event, who will bring mentors on site and who will support you with know-how. Also, these preparatory events will make you also feel prepared so that when you arrive to the hackathon, you know a little bit what to expect. It's open to tech enthusiasts of all levels, including first-timers. So 70% of hackathon participants in our previous editions were there for the first time in such an event. Yes, so childcare on site, plus coding classes for kids as well. And finally, no overnight coding, so that the event is parent-friendly overall. And yeah, anyone with children can come back at night to their home and continue hacking on the following morning. So now, Chris is also known online as Enzima due to mistakes that he made as a teenager that will now haunt him forever. He's active primarily on GitHub, and he also listens to music at every time that he can, and obsessively tracks almost every aspect of his life. Now, he has previously worked as a technical architect for ETH Zurich, University of Zurich, and as a senior solutions architect at Ivan, based in Finland. Earlier this year, Chris founded a contracting outfit to consult an open source software primarily focused on data pipelines and storage systems. 70% of his time is dedicated to for-profit clients in order to fund 30% of his time to be offered to at reduced cost or at no cost to non-profit organizations like Women++, also academic institutions and charities. Chris has been a board member of Women++ since 2019, acting as a key member in instructing participants during our initiatives, designing the architecture for our programs, and supporting with strategic and key decisions in the organization to move forward. So without further ado, now, Chris, the stage is yours.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming to this thing. We've got 2 hours, might not need it, but this is basically designed to be as collaborative as possible. So any kind of questions you have about anything to do with hackathons, it doesn't just have to be about coding projects or whatever else, then feel free to interrupt. or yeah, do the hand raising thing, or throw something in the chat. Cool. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, has anybody done a hackathon before? Okay. Nice. The hand raising thing works there. Fair enough. And out of curiosity, who here is like currently in or studying to be, has some technical background? Nice. Yeah, that seems like a good mix as well. And since there is a mix, oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, nice. Was the bootcamp in Switzerland as well? Yeah. Cool. So if there are any terms or tools that get mentioned that you don't know or haven't recognized or haven't heard of, that's reasonable. Yeah, just stop me and ask, or put it in the chat as well, and make sure they get covered. But hopefully most of these things you should have heard of, or at least maybe seen around on Reddit and places. Cool. So these are the 4 rules for a hackathon. Just give up all your time. Smart clothes, funeral suit if you've got it. Just eat whatever you can find and don't stop coding. But this is the crap advice that was given in maybe 2015 for the weird bro culture that started hackathons. And I mean, hackathon is already a questionable name, especially when they first started. Nobody really wants to host something called hackathon, right? It sounds dodgy. It sounds like you're going to do something illegal. But yeah, so I got involved in hackathons in maybe like 2010. When I was studying for my undergraduate, we held them at our university a few times a year, usually for companies or tools that we liked using, like Foursquare at the time, which for some reason still exists, but is a lot less popular now. But Twitter as well. But usually they're based around a theme, right? So either they're based or sponsored by a company that says use our tools, make something cool with it, or they're around a theme like for social good, or using a mobile app framework, or probably there'll be a bunch around ChatGPT and stuff now. Yeah, but ignore all that advice. That's crap, and it definitely isn't a fun or good way to make software either quickly or in the long term. So I tried to revise this a little bit based on participating in, organizing, working with Women++ and others over the past decade or more, to try and be a bit more useful and hopefully more inclusive as well. But these slides are available in a public repository in Women++'s GitHub, which we'll also look at in a bit. So don't worry if there's too much text here. But essentially you're doing this for you, right? It's cool to work in a team, and it's cool to do it for a good cause, but it's very easy to get caught up in the, oh crap, we only have 3 days, or we only have 2 days. We've got to get this done. We've got a deliverable. It has to look good, whatever else. But realistically, you're giving up your time, which is pretty valuable, to ideally have fun and learn a few things, right? So that's basically it. If you find that you can't sleep the week before the hackathon, maybe you don't have to worry about it, right? It doesn't have to be a thing that causes anxiety, a thing that causes stress. Seeing it as a social activity, as a learning activity, rather than a very short period of high stress, is, I think, healthier. It means you get more out of it, as well as hopefully the people you're working with. And as Louisa mentioned earlier as well, this whole idea of coding into the night. I mean, you don't drink and drive, right? And if you drive when you haven't slept for 2 days, you're also very likely to crash your car. And I'm a pretty shit coder as it is. So if I haven't slept for 2 days, I'm also going to write worse code. So I'm less useful to my team if I do stay awake while they go. This idea of being the last person in the office just is not, it's not a good idea, right? And I'm also a fairly introverted, maybe anxious person, I guess. So the social side of the hackathon is probably maybe the scarier part. Yeah, you have the idea that obviously you have to stand up and present in front of people, but to show up to a place that maybe you've never been to before, and then they say get into a team, that's also pretty stressful, right? Quite a few hackathons have options like team rooms, group chats, etc., where you can meet people that are participating before. We'll share a link later to the Women++ Slack, or you can organize unofficially, right? So if you can meet people before, that's great. Organize in forums or whatever, getting to know people that might have shared skills, shared ideals. At least you have some faces that you might know, but equally, you're all there for the same reason, right? So just showing up with a laptop, it's still perfectly okay to sit next to some strangers and code for a couple of days. But yeah, I listed as many ethical chatting tools, but I mean, there's WhatsApp and stuff as well for organizing chats, and obviously Slack too. But the last point is a pretty big one. Especially, it's easy to split your team, right? Based on, we have a front end dev, we have a back end dev, we got somebody that knows design, and maybe there's somebody that knows a bit more about business, so they'll do the presenting side, and that's cool. And probably you'll make something good in the weekend with those skills. But then it's very easy to just do your thing, right? So the back end person will say, okay, I'm going to get some details from this API, and they'll spend all of Saturday doing that, while the front end person designs an interface for that. And that's all great, but essentially then you're just writing code, right? It's just the same things you could do in an evening in your apartment or house. Going in, over communicating, actually becoming more like a team. Maybe the front end person wants to try back end code for a bit, or maybe you want to try swapping tasks. Maybe you want to do something where you're not particularly experienced in, right? So this idea of just don't get lost in an idea for 8 hours and then come back with something that you can deliver. It's a lot better if you're just constantly telling everybody what's going on. This over communication means that you don't have to tap somebody on the shoulder while they've got their headphones on to ask where this thing is, right? If you've got some way of constantly communicating, equally you can switch it off, right? You can still close Slack, you can close Signal when you need to focus. But this idea of knowing where somebody is without just thinking they're in the corner, they'll give us something in 6 hours, is pretty useful. And that's probably the biggest skill I gained from participating in hackathons. Of it's not all on me, right? I can't deliver everything. I can't do everything for the team. So I need to ask for help, but I also need to tell other people where I'm at. So I don't just come in and say, oh, I already did this. You don't need to do that. Yeah, another important one, I guess, is it's pretty easy, especially if you have some kind of technical background or you started studying. Once you start hearing about the problems, you think, I could do that with this, or like, I could use this Python framework for that, or we could use this database to store these things, and that's cool. That's your background and your experience coming towards finding a solution. But just jumping straight in is, I mean, that's never a good project, right? You don't start a job with a company and they say, let's just write some code and see what happens. Somebody has requirements, right? That's having this kind of problem statement presented to you. is good, but equally you're a team of people with probably different backgrounds, right? So the ideas that you have could be, the way you interpret that problem could be completely opposite to the person next to you, right? And that's not a bad thing, that's perfectly valid. We've talked about this before in other webinars, but the idea of having people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different genders, different lifestyles, etc., in one team makes a more varied product, makes a more diverse product, and a more inclusive product, right? Apple released the face unlock for the iPhone, and it unlocked for like the majority of India, right? Because it was a bunch of white male engineers testing. So of course they develop on that. Their data set just wasn't large enough. They didn't include enough people. They weren't diverse enough in developing that product. It's nice that they improved that quickly, but still they made that initial mistake, and you don't have to do that at the start of a hackathon, right? It's your idea might be the first thing that comes to your head, but the idea of your team, all of those ideas coming together, that's the most likely kind of solution that everybody will be motivated to work on. And also it's 2, sometimes 3 days, right? You're not going to be able to write a lot of code in that time. So anything you can do that gives you the kind of unique edge for that product. Maybe there's data sets already available. Maybe there's frameworks for that specific thing, making a medical app or something like this. So look at what's already available. Has the company provided something specific? Do they have research maybe that they haven't shared with their problem statement? Is there anything else? Published data sets or solutions, exercises, etc., that are online that you could use? Yeah, anything you can do that is slightly different to essentially what most people do, which is to create a GitHub repository and maybe start a Miro board or something to mock up some designs, is always useful. Yeah, this is a thing I've read in many self-help books. It's the sunk cost fallacy, this idea that you've been working on something for so long that you think, I have to keep working on it, right? I've come this far, I might as well finish. But particularly when you have 24 hours to work on a thing, if you've come this far and it's not working, it's also okay to walk away, right? And for me, this was kind of a context switch, or a different way of thinking that changed what going to a hackathon meant. It's not to go make something, present it, and then walk away. It is to go and try a bunch of stuff, right? Stuff that you don't have time to try maybe in your, or the freedom to try in your day job, or the time to try in your free time. So there's tools, frameworks, libraries, whatever that you want to try out that you think are interesting. The hackathon is the place where you get the freedom to try that with a team of people. And yeah, if it doesn't work, that's cool. Then just put it in a repository somewhere and try something else, right? It doesn't have to be that you spend a day on it and then you continue. So seeing it as this kind of scratch pad, I found particularly useful. And yeah, this was advice that was actually given on, I think, Hacker News as a forum for tech news and things. But the best idea typically is not your first idea and isn't the actual best idea, right? It's the one that you can make in the weekend. And that doesn't mean that you can implement completely in a weekend, but something that you can mock up that's a bit functional, that fits within the skills of the team, etc. But just because you might have a winning idea, and sure, you can do that after the hackathon, and you've got 6 months or you've got $100,000 in funding, but the one that you can actually get up and running and get presented. But yeah. And yeah, I mean, there's different hackathons, different purposes, different kind of atmospheres as well, I guess. But primarily, if you're going to a hackathon that is sponsored by companies, then it's because they want you or your team member or your colleague or someone in your network, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's a fair exchange, right? It's you're going there, you're offering some time, but you're also seeing how that company operates. You're able to speak to people there. If anything, it's a much nicer environment than going through whiteboard interviews or a bunch of email exchanges with recruiters and things, right? So yes, you've got the pressure of the hackathon, you've got the pressure to build, you've got this pressure maybe to be productive, but there is a bunch of other stuff going on. As Louisa talked about before, there's other activities, technical and non-technical. There's like childcare available. It's not just you that has to show up to these hackathons, right? It can be you and your family, you and friends. But yeah, they might have some yoga, they might have some kind of mindfulness, meditation things, and, but primarily network, right? If you're stuck on something, the best idea is to get up and walk around, right? You don't just sit and stare at the code that's not compiling or something. So you've got people there you can speak to. Sure, you can ask them for help, but you can also ask them about something completely different, right? Like, what benefits will they offer? Do they pay for your gym or laser eye surgery or whatever fancy tech stuff they want to do? I don't know. Maybe they'll buy you a treadmill. They won't, by the way. Nobody has bought me a treadmill. I had to buy that myself. Yeah, but start a company and then you can expense it. Who knows? But this relates back to the first point. If it's not fun, it's not worth doing, right? And that doesn't mean if it's just a little bit stressful, walk away from it. But if what you're putting into it doesn't match what you get out of it, you don't need to do it, right? If you don't want to network and you just want to sit there and code, that's also fine, right? You put your headphones on and you do that. If you don't want to do yoga, that's reasonable. Yeah, if you prefer to go out and buy a KFC than eat the vegan pizza, sure. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else does track everything about their life, but definitely like prepping as much as possible is useful, but it's also fun is maybe the wrong word, but this idea of like you know what's coming, and you have some kind of comfort, I guess, in like this is the environment that I'll be using, these are the tools that I'll be using, this is what my team knows, this is what I know. The more you have prepped, and it sounds trivial, but at least in the old days of hackathons, like it was really like minutes that counted. Like switching HDMI connections on laptops was problematic. So if your code took 2 seconds to run every time you made a change, this was a big deal. So if you have your your editor set up ready on your machine, you've got a repository that everybody has access to already by the time the hackathon starts. This is kind of a relief, right? That you don't have to kind of click around or wait for access to things. And we'll come to this link in a second, but luckily, I guess the world of software as a service is huge, and they want customers, right? So free tiers is a thing. So you can get thousands of dollars from Google Cloud. You can get free access to APIs, to data sets. GitHub will let you use most of their tools as long as the repositories are open, publicly available. So it's pretty great, right? You don't pay. There's no expense for you apart from your privacy in some cases, I guess. But you can use a fake email address if you need to. But the second 2 points here, I guess, are partly related to prep, but they're more about the prep of the project. I don't know if anybody here has accessibility issues or particular setups when they're using their machines, but some people may be using a screen reader, for example. Even things like using a special keyboard, right? If you have repetitive strain injury or issues with your wrist, even a special mouse. Obviously, there are workspaces that will accommodate to that, but it doesn't just affect how you work, it affects how your team works with you as well, right? So maybe GitHub doesn't have that level of accessibility, so you decide within your team that you use maybe GitLab instead or something else. But it will also probably change how you develop the project that you're working on as well, right? That if you have people from multiple countries working together, then probably you want it to work in multiple languages. And Switzerland is a good example that you'll be having like German, French, English, Italian, maybe Romansh, who knows? So just hard coding a bunch of English text to show up in the web page or the app that you're making is maybe not what you want to do from scratch, right? Maybe you want to have translations available for each of the screens that you make. And for those that do come from technical backgrounds, it's quite easy to think, I use this cool new technology, and like we use this framework, and we compiled Rust into a website and using WebAssembly, and that's cool. Everybody that sees this is going to think this is a great idea, but that's not true, right? You have people on the panel that may not have a fully technical background, or those that maybe focused more on the business or design side. So just showing a repository of code doesn't speak for itself, right? If I just showed you the markdown that makes up these slides, that wouldn't be useful, right? It would be difficult to read. The design would be slightly worse than this. So actually showing something from what you've made, demoing the code, sure, that's useful. But equally showing mockups, talking about the business value or the value that you bring to users, those kind of things, make them obvious. And definitely don't start the presentation at like 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, because it needs to be given as much priority as what you're making, right? It's unlikely that you'll make a finished product within 2 days. So it's not that you can just demo it at the end of the Sunday, right? You need to have something that you can show, and maybe you do have something working by the end of the first day, and that's cool. Then you can screen record that. So if it's not working on the Sunday, you already have something that you can show that walks through the functional product. Cool. And fake it as well. Like use Figma, use other tools to mock up the idea that you have, like your skills, how you work together. That's realistically what is being judged, as well as coding, design abilities. So if you've had some breakthrough idea with your team, then yeah, that's good. And if you can mock that up into screens because you don't have the time to actually code it, that's also fine, right? And maybe he's taking this code at the end and running it to test you. But do be honest about that, right? So don't say you've delivered something that you haven't. It's worth saying this is what we got. This is what we achieved as a team. Cool. Yeah. And this is a great example. Just putting an image into some markdown into the presentation that doesn't make it work, right? If you want to put a screenshot of your code in, that's nice. Just switching to the code itself is rarely useful, but equally putting an image in that isn't accurately sized, isn't suitable, then it's going to look weird. But you can use tools like Carbon to generate these kind of code screenshots that are properly sized for the slides. They have the code highlighting, and it looks prettier than just showing the tool I spoke about for a mockup. There's Figma. There's a few others. We can go through those a bit later. I just saw that message in the chat, and we'll look at this tool Carbon as well when it looks better than that. And yeah, I'm sure you've all seen this. I don't know if some of you may be using it in your day jobs. That's cool. But that's not why you signed up to do a hackathon, right? So tools like this, great. Things that are there to work alongside you, great. Things that make your coding life, your design life, your presenting life easier, excellent, use those. But just opening up OpenAI's website or others and saying, write me some CSS that does this, that's no fun, right? You can do that at home. It's better to let somebody in your team write some crappy CSS than let OpenAI do it for you. So there's a few tools. We'll talk about some of those for the when we talk about the free tools that are available. So CodeGPT, that plugs into your editor. So does Ada, Polycoder. They're both kind of free tools that they can work off your own AI models, so your own large language models. So you might be running one on your laptop because you don't want OpenAI to have all of your data, or for them to start a monopoly in AI. So these kind of tools are then local. They run on your machine. And Pocket Base and Superbase, again, I'll present these separately in a second, but these kind of tools that give you like a framework out of the box, like data storage or like a ready-to-go API, those kind of things are super useful. And yeah, we'll come to them in a second. And these links will go through the Women++ repository as well in a second. But we have the Slack community, the Hackathon Survival Kit, which we'll cover a bit of as well in this session. And then equally our website for information on Hack and Lead Deploy Impact. And if you do need to know more that you didn't get a chance to ask in this, then you can email us. That's also fine. Or ask in the community, because then it's not just us that you're getting responses from. Cool. I'm not going to go through everything in this, but yeah, this is huge, right? If you're looking for a free tier to something, you're going to find it on this website, free4.dev. That's not just tools to run on your machine, but that's also cloud accounts, things for unit testing, things for learning about things, so courses, hosted software, databases, places to store code that aren't just GitHub. There's a whole bunch of options there, and in a lot of cases, particularly for the larger companies, they're willing to give away kind of thousands of dollars of access. Particularly people like Google Cloud, they are very generous to people that are just starting up. So they give away kind of a few $1,000s of credits, and GitHub and Microsoft are also extremely generous in offering things for a free tier, as long as your work stays public. Cool. So two of the other tools, you may have a smaller team one day than the other, right? So you may have nobody that has back-end knowledge, or you may have a team of only front-end people, only designers. That's fine. There are a bunch of tools available, open source tools as well, that offer out-of-the-box solutions. Pocket Base is a particularly cool one because it's basically just one single file that you run on your machine, and it creates an interface where you can make objects and then it generates an API for you, an API that can handle authentication, it can handle file uploads, everything, all in just a SQLite file. So you don't have to put anything in the cloud. You just run it on your machine, and it's good to go. You can share it with your team. This kind of stuff is great because the complexity is small. Like, you can get started within a few minutes, and if you break it somehow, you just delete that directory and start again. So Pocketbase is a really good way of experimenting before you'd go to put something in production or something larger. I don't work for any of these companies, so this is just pushing stuff that I think is cool, that luckily fits mine, Women++'s values. But Superbase is kind of the advanced version then of Pocketbase. The way that they work is they give you kind of this, what they call a studio, the same kind of thing as Pocketbase. Authentication, file uploads, all of that stuff works out of the box. They provide the database, they provide all this generation for you, and basically just creates an API. So you don't have to worry about making endpoints using frameworks like Flask or Django or something like this. And you can just focus on your web front end or your mobile app, but you still get all that functionality. So the other tool that was mentioned is Figma. They're not open source, but still people love them. If anybody knows of open source alternatives, then let me know as well. But these things like Figma and Miro are quite good because they are products in the cloud, so you can share these links with your team. You can work on them together to create screen mockups, and they have a bunch of icons and layouts and things like this already available, so that they're kind of preloaded in. Cool. Yeah, so let me switch to. So who has used Git or GitHub before? Okay. Okay, and that's like a quarter of people here. Yeah, so the slide that we had about kind of prep and more prep, if you don't have Git installed in your machine, definitely install it. If you don't have a GitHub account, just definitely recommend signing up. Or if you want to use an alternative, then GitLab, Gitea, Bitbucket, there's plenty of others. But being familiar with the concepts of Git, especially not just using it for your own purposes, right? So not just on your machine, you write some code and you commit and then you push, but dealing with pulling others' code down from the same repository, working on pull requests, these kind of things are useful. And there's a bunch of courses and tutorials. GitHub has incredible documentation around this, and so does GitLab. So if you want resources on that, then let us know as well, and we can share them. But for Hacker Lead, for Deploy Impact, our Women++, so github.com/Women++, we have a bunch of open source repositories, partly for webinars that we've held over the years, but also of previous things. So previous projects that were developed. Last year's Deploy Impact code is there, as well as the year before. This year's Deploy Impact stuff will also be put there. So you can view all of that. And we've got some pinned repositories. So this webinar that you're watching now is there at the top, the last one that we gave next to it, and then other webinars around Python and natural language processing, and those things are there.
Sorry to interrupt, Chris. There is also one introduction to GitHub, actually. We can share it with the resources after this webinar. in case you're just starting and you want to set up your GitHub account.
Yep. Nice, thanks. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that you need to use a terminal, that you need to use the command line to know Git, right? GitHub has a desktop application, but there are a bunch of graphical clients available as well. So using the command line is a plus. Knowledge of the terminal is useful, but you don't have to know it to use it equally. You can edit code directly inside GitHub as well, right? So I can make these changes and then commit that. Do all the wrong things, commit directly to the main branch with commit message, and there you go. So essentially, you could do everything you wanted using a Chromebook instead of having your Mac or your Windows machine with a terminal set up. Cool. So around halfway, maybe a bit over halfway. Does anybody have any questions or specific tools or yeah, anything that they would like to be covered? This, I guess, our previous kind of introduction to hackathons, or before the first hacker lead. So we got some slightly updated slides around that. So we'll probably use maybe the rest of the time to go through a bit about the first technical-ish steps that you do in a hackathon, right? So like setting up the project, a bit about getting Git installed and those kind of things. But if there are other topics, other tools that you want to know about, things setting up editors, extensions to use, things to optimize or automate, then let me know, and we can look at that as well. As I spent years optimizing my setup, I guess, to be as productive as possible. So things like offline code searching, command line tools that are useful, those kind of things, then we can cover those as well. Cool. All right, yeah, so before the break, we talked a little bit about Git and other command line tools, and that there are graphical interfaces available, which of course you can use, but I guess if you want to do stuff quickly, usually the terminal is the place to do that. Instructions for installing software and things from GitHub and other places will typically give you the command line to run, rather than links to an exe or a DMG or app or something like this. And make this a lot bigger. That legible for people. So having a terminal that looks pretty is always nice, because then you're more motivated to use it. And if anybody does code on Windows, then probably know that by default it looks hideous. So like some kind of color scheme is useful, something that doesn't look so painful on the eyes. But equally, tools could be installed as well to make using the command line a bit nicer. So things like this auto completion, right? So instead of having to search my history, I can see now that the last command I ran with GI at the start was git push origin main. and then I can search through that rather than having to remember keywords for what's the keyboard shortcut to search my history and those kind of things. So terminal's quicker and prove that. So yeah, if you're on Windows, you've got Windows key in R, type CMD, and that will open. And I guess now you've got the Windows terminal, which has Linux inside of it, as well as PowerShell and Bash and all those things. The Mac has the terminal app, if you want to use that. And most Linux machines support just opening terminal with Control Alt and T as well. And we could skip through that because yeah, Windows has Windows subsystem for Linux. That's a big deal. But when you look at instructions online about installing something through Docker or using Git or whatever, you'll normally see this at the start, this $sign and something else, right? That's the prompt. And that is the same there. That's the same, right? This is the prompt. So mine is not a $sign. It's overly complicated. It has the time on it. It has the directory that I'm in. For some reason, the name of my computer, if I ever forget that, and my username. I make it seem like it's stupid, but the reason I have the name of my computer is because if I connect to another machine, then I know I'm not on my machine anymore, right? So if you do have to SSH or connect to remote machines as part of your job, it is sometimes useful so that I don't suddenly save a file on a machine in Asia rather than on my laptop, which I do more regularly than I should. Yeah, so you may be more used to seeing this $sign prompt. That's more common, right? So when you don't have this kind of shell setup, what you see is the standard, and you can configure those with a bunch of frameworks, and we can look at those as well if we want to, or we can just, yeah. Cool. So PWD, present working directory, these kind of short commands make it useful, a lot easier to kind of navigate around your computer, but also the project that you've got set up, right? Because you might be working with someone on a Windows machine or somebody on Linux when you're on a Mac. So making sure that you're not hard coding things or using file names like /users/Chris or whatever else is pretty vital. So knowing those kind of things and making sure, like, I don't put that in the README file or something like this, right? Because if anybody using Linux, or actually anybody that's just not called Chris G, is going to struggle to find this, right? So trying to be as I don't know, inclusive or system agnostic, I guess, is pretty useful. So if you're doing anything with these kind of instructions, then doing it relative to the directory that you're in. Like, I already know I'm in the hackathon prep directory, so I might just tell somebody like open img/image1.png, right? So I don't have to give this whole path. Yeah, slashes. I mean, most editors will fix this stuff for you as well. But if you're writing code or you're including files, then you might be used to doing something like that. And now this will take me to the root of my hard drive, right? And luckily, this padlock is telling me you can't put anything there because you're not allowed. But on a Windows machine, you are allowed. But there you would use this / instead of this /. There's mostly just stuff that is useful to know, because what runs on your machine may not run on your colleague's machine, right, or your teammate. Yeah. Do people know these commands, or is this useful stuff to know, or do you want me to skip ahead? What are people's thoughts? Okay, if it's useful, we'll carry on. So, does anybody know what CD stands for? Yeah, change directory. Yeah, I saw you say it, Claudia. Thanks. So yeah, CD here. So I've just gone from hackathon prep, which is nested deep inside a folder on my Mac, to the root of my hard drive. This // yeah. How could I go back there from here? Does anybody know what that command would be? So there's the tedious way, where I can say users g dev women ++ webinars, right? But that's not particularly fun. What if I could just go cd minus? And what that is doing, it's saying cd minus, cd negative, cd take away, so go back to where I just came from, right? So I can use that to go back. So if you have suddenly gone into some sample directory to try out a website that you just downloaded, great. But once you finish with it, you can just use cd minus to go back. And if I do want to go home, what does anybody know the symbol I would use for that? It's or this thing, the tilde, that thing. So on Mac and Linux, and actually on the recent versions of Windows, this is a quick way to get into my home directory. So that home directory is, for Mac users, user/your username. On Windows, let's see, /users and whatever, and Linux, home/your username. So this is the same as this, the same as this. So that one character there helps that to work on pretty much every machine, right? So this symbol is recognized by pretty much every operating system. That's where I want to go. Cool. And yeah, if we switch to Bash, and we go into this webinars hackathon prep, that's what normal ls looks like for people, right? So ls is list files, and it's awful, as you can see, right? So it's just a horizontal list. I don't know what the size of them are. I don't know if one's a directory or not. But with this, that's an information overload, possibly, but I can see that there is a Git directory. I can see this is a directory. This is a file. This is a file. This is a PDF file. So that quick glance into what's available. And I'm not just showing you how to use ls. These are like command line switches, they're called. So when you put a dash, maybe people use kubectl as a tool. This -h or -help, it's a command line switch. So you're basically telling whatever tool in your command line to do something, right? So if you give it nothing, you give that tool nothing and say run, normally they'll print out this -h or -help or -help. So that's telling you how that tool can be used, and ls can do the same. Or here, I'm giving these command line switches to say, what does anybody know what AHL means? Or individually, that each of them stands for something, so it would be the same as I could do ls A, H, or L, or I can include multiple, or I can split them up like this as well. So does anybody know what the A stands for in ls? That's all. Typically, you wouldn't see these files, these dot files at the start. They're hidden directories. So .git is a hidden directory, but sometimes you do want to mess around with it. So all is the A. H means human readable. So don't just give me like a really long number to tell me the size of the file. Tell me that it's 300 kilobytes or it's 5 megabytes or 6 gigabytes. Otherwise, by default, it will just print it out in bytes, which should just be huge. And then L means list. Means don't show it like the kind of horizontal printing. You get the list. So you get this vertical one after the other printout. Cool. So command line switches, and then we've got arguments. We can skip over the actual exercise part, and that's not super necessary. But covering the basic use of the terminal is great, but the actual original setup, right? So you get into the hackathon, you've decided your teams, you've talked amongst yourselves, and you want to try something out. The easiest thing to do is just create a directory and you just git in it, and you create a Git repository, right? But as talked about in the presentation from the first half, the whole aim of the hackathon is it's a scratch pad, right? It's a scratch pad for ideas. And realistically, you have two ways of working together. One is you work on your machines individually, and you have a repository, and you each commit and push and pull from it. Or you can use collaborative code editors, right? So GitHub has a web IDE that you can use. So does GitLab as well. So you can all write your code in the same place. Equally, using something like Visual Studio Code or the open source version without the analytics and stuff inside of it, the VS Codium, extensions are available, so you can share this workspace with the rest of your team. So you all have Visual Studio Code running, but you each connect in, and then you can edit the same files together. So if you don't know Git, haven't used Git before, then still being able to share access, use other people's machines, use the same editor is pretty cool. Or you can do it the extra old-fashioned way and just one big paired programming, right? So one person types and everybody sits around that laptop. What I typically do is I have a folder for Women++, and let's say this is for the hackathon. I'll create a directory called Scratch. Inside that will be just everything. I'll just put some files in, mess around with some ideas. Maybe I'll go to GitHub and I'll download some React app that looks useful, putting all of that into this directory. This is where my ideas go to either live or die, basically. And at the end of the weekend, I would just delete this directory from my machine. So trying everything out there, even just a text file with a log of the things that I did, ideas that I've had, etc., can all go in here. And when you have something that works, then you move it into your repository, the one that you share with your team, right? So Project A or whatever you've chosen to call it. Cool. So people said they knew about Git. Have people here used Docker or Podman or containers or anything like this? Hands up if you have used some kind of container things. Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, yeah. So you've got tools like Docker, Podman, nerdctl. Essentially, they're all the same kind of things. Containers, they are lightweight operating systems that you can run, mini virtual machines that you can put on your computer. And if anybody has a Mac from the last 2 years, then they know how difficult that is to get running on their machines, because Apple decided to make a whole different architecture, basically. So running things like Docker on an M1 or an M2 chip on a Mac is not as simple as it was using the Intel processors. But some of you may know, if you've used Docker or other things in your business work life, that Docker changed their licensing last year, which makes it incredibly restrictive, even for individual developers to use Docker without paying them for a licensing fee. That's entirely up to your beliefs if you want to pay the licensing fee or use Docker or any of the other things. But there are a bunch of cool open source alternatives that don't have the same restrictions. So if you are using Docker within your company, then obviously you expect your employer to pay that licensing fee. But if you are using Docker for any kind of your personal commercial things, then you need to pay that cost. Rancher Desktop is an open source application that allows you to use things like Docker. Basically, it does let you use Docker in the same way. It also sets up a Kubernetes cluster on your machine if you want to do that. But that's definitely, don't use Kubernetes in a hackathon. It's too much. But there are other tools. We'll follow up with these links as well. Multipass is another one. This is particularly cool, primarily if you use Linux, but it also works on Mac and Windows. But it's a GUI tool that just lets you create virtual machines super quickly. So when I talked about creating a Scratch directory and I would just delete it afterwards, if you want to try out installing a piece of software that has a bunch of requirements or something that's resource heavy, like setting up Postgres on your machine or MySQL or anything else, using something like Multipass gives you like a blank, empty virtual machine, and you try out installing a piece of software on it, and then you delete it when you don't want it anymore. So I have Multipass here, and I press this button, and I wait, and this gives me a shell into an Ubuntu virtual machine running on my computer. And if I want to make another one, or if I want to delete this, then I can just click the button, tell it to stop, or I can just quit Multipass. So this is particularly good for setting things up quickly and messing around installing applications. Equally, having a consistent environment, right? If you've got people using Windows and you're using Mac, then maybe everybody using a Linux-based virtual machine to develop stuff is useful. Cool. Yeah. And we have the generic warnings here as well. That obviously, when you're using the terminal, some tools might ask you to type the word sudo in. Do people know what sudo stands for? It's super user do. So you're basically saying, I, as a mere user of my computer, I'm not allowed to do this, but I understand the risks, and I want you to run it as a super user. So maybe installing certain pieces of software, running certain pieces of software, then you'll run it using the sudo command. But equally, if you go to a random GitHub repository and it tells you to run this script as sudo, then that may be a great piece of software that you and your team want to use, but equally that script might just tell your hard drive to delete everything, right? So just because it's open source or it comes from a company that you recognize, never run a command like that. If anybody asks you or tells you copy the script, or like wget, the same kind of thing, never do that. Any of these piping things into a shell, this is a bad idea. And it doesn't mean you can't use that script, but just do that first. Download that file to your machine and then run it. Open it, run it, verify it. But definitely never run anything that says, I'm going to ask for sudo now, until you've looked at its text and it's on GitHub. That's available, right? So you can check their install scripts. Luckily, most sites that recommend using these mention these warnings. So as I said, the terminal may be a quick way of doing things, but equally, yeah, you can destroy your entire machine. Or if you are going to run those scripts, then use multipass, use Docker, use something else. So if you destroy your running container, it doesn't matter, right? Just delete it. Or use the free tier and set up a server running in Microsoft Azure, something like this. So don't sacrifice your personal laptop just to get something up and running quickly. Because she's not forgiving, right? Your terminal, your computer is not forgiving. If you destroy those things, you might be able to press Control-C or close your terminal, but getting it back is not as easy as running the command. Cool. So that's most of the things I have covered. I've got some things on tools and stuff that I use. I guess even things like this. This is an app called which is as uncomfortable to say as any app can be, but it is also great, free to use. But these extra things that make a presentation look slightly better, slightly more accessible, weird, is fun, right? And anything that's going to be eye-catching in a presentation at the end of a long weekend when everybody's pretty tired, stuff like this is pretty good. And it's also generally just fun to do, but you can still call it professionalism. So yeah. And there are a bunch of tools like this. OBS Studio is an open source version of this that is incredibly powerful but slightly harder to use. This one is just a drag and drop tool that I can just move things around on, or we'll start sharing that screen. But if anybody has questions, then I'll stick around, and hopefully see some of you at Hack and Lead or in Deploy Impact. And yeah, thanks. And also, good luck. Yeah, I'll read that out. So I have doubts about the formation of the team. You mentioned groups of events that we can participate in, interact with. Have a moment to help with team building on the first day. It's usually a time to present ourselves and talk about challenge of interest. Are you going to participate in a hackathon tomorrow? And you didn't get any interaction in the event group to assemble a team. Okay. Well, I guess the comforting thing is probably the anxiety that you have about forming a team is probably the same anxiety that everybody else has about forming a team. So it's the first thing most people will want to do when they arrive tomorrow, right? And if the organizers have already provided a shared Slack and it hasn't been discussed on there, then that means that will be some of the first activities that get set up. But I will say it's not a bad thing to take charge of that, right? And obviously, if it shows up in the agenda that is the first thing coming up, great. But if you do find people are a bit lost, maybe, or struggling to figure out where to sit or what to do, then going in and at least finding people that are looking to do the same kind of thing as you, or kind of organizing, be the first one to sit down at a table, but don't put headphones on, for example, so that you're open to chat, is probably what I would recommend. But don't be afraid to ask a question 5 or 6 times on Slack. As I've found, people might check it one day, but it gets lost the next day, right? And it's not annoying unless you're pinging individuals over and over again to ask, I'm here now, who wants to set up a team once you arrive, or I'm on the way in. Those things are okay. That's what Slack is for, right? It is for real-time updates. So if you show some enthusiasm, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And Slack is a tool where you can configure and turn off notifications. So it's not a thing you have to worry about bothering people. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. It's difficult to organize actually the team building part unless you are part of the organizing team. I fully appreciate that, and you don't want to be the individual that's kind of bossing around others or trying to organize something in place of the organizers. But it's perfectly reasonable, I think, to take charge, especially for your own comfort, but you probably find make others comfortable as well. I think an additional thing you talked about where we can present ourselves. I've personally always disliked that because I'd like other people to present themselves, but I don't want to have to do that myself because it's uncomfortable. But there are very cool asynchronous tools for doing this as well, right? And the tool I talked about, which is the last time I'll say that name, but you can record yourself, or you can set up a Google Meet and record yourself talking about yourself, right? Or even just use it from your iPhone or Android or whatever camera, and put that asynchronously into Slack, and maybe others will do it that way. Or even private message one of the organizers and say, do you have any kind of apps for installing into Slack? Like there's one called Donut that pairs people randomly together. So maybe speaking with those people that are in charge and seeing if they have something in place, or if maybe it's the first time or early times that they're organizing these, and they may also want some pointers or welcome the help.